Good evening, Dom. I'd like to tell you a story that happened to me during my teenage years. When I was 17, my father got a new job in another state, and that forced us to move. It was a sudden change for me, and I must say it was hard to leave my friends and the school I was used to. Despite the distance, I always stayed in touch with my 3 best friends, Pedro, Bruno, and Austin. Every Friday we would have a video call on Facebook to keep in contact. But one night, after Austin sent a video in the chat, things got really scary and bizarre. It was a typical Friday night. My parents had already gone to bed, and I was alone in my room. As usual, I joined the video call with the guys. I remember that at the time the 2018 World Cup was happening, and we spent quite a while talking about it. When we were almost ready to say goodbye, Austin suddenly said in the chat, "Hey guys, want to see something interesting?" And that's when the story starts to get strange. Bruno quickly replied, "Sure, send it." Without saying anything else, Austin shared a horrible video in the group of a man being skinned alive. The guy was lying on a table, his hands and feet tied down with straps at the corners, while someone wearing a mask, very similar to the one from the movie Scream, was peeling his skin off with a scalpel as if he were skinning a rabbit. And the most disturbing part, the man was fully conscious throughout the whole thing. The video lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to make me jump out of my chair completely terrified. Pedro immediately shouted, "What the hell is this? Why did you send us that, dude? Where the hell did you get this video?" Bruno was also shocked and asked the same thing. I, being the kind of person who gets easily scared, was so paralyzed by those horrific images that it took me a while to type anything in the chat. When I finally caught my breath, the only thing I could say was, "Never send me that crap again." Even though the video seemed super real and disturbing, I thought it might just be one of those gory films that look real, because in my mind it was impossible for people to actually do something so horrible and inhumane. But Pedro insisted, "Austin, where did you get this video?" And that's when he replied, "I'll tell you, but seriously, you guys have to promise not to talk about this with anyone." We were silent for a second until Pedro, half-jokingly, said, "Man, please tell me you weren't the psychopath who filmed this." "Of course not, you idiots. I'm not that brave," Austin replied. We laughed and started teasing him, agreeing that he really wouldn't have the guts to do something like that. But after the joking, he admitted that he got the video from the dark web. I had heard of this dark web before, but only vaguely, as that hidden corner of the internet where you can buy illegal stuff. Although I didn't fully understand it, I had heard some rumors about it while growing up, but I never had any idea of the atrocities going on there, let alone that people were selling this kind of content. Knowing that really shook me, but what scared me the most was the fact that Austin was interested in this sort of thing and knew how to access it. From what little I knew, the dark web was some kind of secret network that you couldn't just get into easily. I always thought it was hacker stuff and such. After that, Austin sent a photo. It was of a woman with no arms or legs, and next to her was a sign that said, "Doll number 30. In the description, it said something like, "Inhumane acts that can be done to victims before they're sent to buyers." I felt very uncomfortable reading that, but I was still a bit skeptical about the authenticity of it all. It was hard to believe it was real, although the image, just like the previous video, seemed frighteningly real. What bothered me the most was, since when had Austin been involved in this kind of thing? I'd known him since elementary school, and although we shared a love for horror movies, I never imagined he would be interested in something so sick in real life. I asked him directly, "Why do you visit those sites? Since when are you interested in such cruel and depraved things?" He replied, "Oh, I only go there every now and then just out of curiosity." But in the middle of the conversation, a random user joined the video call. "Who's that?" we all asked. "I have no idea, I swear to God," Austin replied. At this point, my nerves were already shot from the whole dark web story. I asked, "Tell me something, Austin, is this one of your idiot friends from the deep web? Because if it is, I'm calling the police." I decided to move my mouse to exit the chat, but it simply wouldn't respond. No matter how many times I clicked or moved the mouse, the cursor wouldn't move at all. That's when the random user's video activated. It was a guy wearing a pig mask, but it didn't look like one of those masks you buy at costume shops. It looked like the skinned face of a real pig. He was wearing it like Leatherface from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Guys, is anyone else seeing this? Austin, seriously, I hope this isn't one of your stupid pranks. I told my friend, knowing that he liked to pull tricks to scare us every now and then. But Austin, clearly nervous, assured me that he had no idea what was going on either. That's when the pig-masked guy got closer to the camera, and for some reason I felt like I was staring into the eyes of pure evil. At that moment, my friend's calls froze. The only screen that still worked was the pigman's, and it seemed like our computers were being hacked. I couldn't understand what was happening until I heard the man say, "Hey, can you see me? Say yes if you can hear me." I jumped back and stammering asked, "What do you want from me?" The guy replied, "Oh, you know that feeling you get when you spend too much time with someone? It's awful. Everything turns into a boring, dull routine. That's why I'm always looking for something new, something fresh. A new doll that makes me feel alive again. Yes, that's all I need. And guess what? I think tonight I'm going to get exactly what I want." I was utterly terrified by all of this, unable to understand anything. But then, a muffled voice started to emerge in the background, sounding like moaning and muffled screams. That's when the pigman turned the camera towards the direction of the sound, and what appeared on the screen was a woman with no arms or legs, with duct tape over her mouth and a chain around her neck. She was desperately trying to escape, flailing the stumps of her arms and legs. A few seconds later, the pigman slowly approached the woman, holding a huge axe. When I saw that, I started hyperventilating. I felt a knot forming in my stomach, and my whole body began to tremble. I was on the verge of a panic attack, just thinking about the horrible and inevitable fate that awaited that woman. When the pigman raised the axe in the air, I screamed in desperation, "Leave her alone! I'm calling the police! Stop this now!" I shut my eyes tight, trying not to see what was about to happen. Before closing my eyes, I realized that woman was the same one from the photo Austin had shared. A moment later, I began to hear the sound of the axe striking, which made me jump from my chair so hard that it landed on the bed. I turned my back to the screen, covering my eyes with my hands, and started crying in pure despair. It was unbearable. But then, suddenly, everything went silent. I removed my hands from my face and turned to the computer, only to see that the pigman had disappeared. I was completely terrified. My heart was racing, my whole body was shaking, and I was in total panic. Suddenly, it was as if nothing had happened, like the whole thing had been a horrible nightmare. But it wasn't. It was completely real, and the scene kept replaying in my mind. I ran to the bathroom, washed my face with plenty of water, and dried myself with a towel. Then I returned to the computer and sent a message in the chat. "Guys, please tell me you saw that too. What the hell just happened?" My friends started responding, confirming that their computers had also been hacked and that they had seen the pigman. But no one wanted to talk much about it. I think we were all in shock. Since that day, my friends and I agreed to leave the matter behind and never speak of it again. However, those images never left my mind, and to this day, I have a recurring nightmare where the video plays in my dreams. Every time it happens, I wake up hyperventilating and trembling, just like when my computer was hacked by the pigman. Before we move on to the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to get the latest stories. It will be a pleasure to have you with us again. Now, let's continue. What I'm about to share weighs on my conscience like a gigantic block of concrete, and honestly, I take no pride in it. A few years ago, I fell victim to an online fraud that, without going into too many details, left me completely bankrupt. Drowning in debt and desperate for a way to earn extra money, I ended up in an even worse situation. I got involved with a criminal organization operating on the dark web. Although the guilt from everything that followed haunts me to this day, I know that nothing I say will exempt me from responsibility. 5 years ago, I was just like anyone else, living an ordinary life with a regular job and a routine without much excitement. I worked as a nurse in a public hospital in my country, and my salary covered my basic expenses: food, housing, transportation, that sort of thing. But then came that bad day when, influenced by a friend, I decided to invest all my savings in an online business that promised to triple the amount in a short time. The result? I ended up being scammed and lost everything, leaving me completely broke. At that same hospital where I worked, there was a doctor no one could understand why he was there. The guy was a leading figure in medicine in our country, had given lectures worldwide, and had an impressive resume. Before showing up at this hospital, he had worked at 2 of the best hospitals in the country, earning a very good salary. But suddenly, he left it all behind and ended up at that public hospital which, like many government-funded hospitals around here, struggled with structural and budget issues, even though it was one of the largest in the country. All of this seemed very strange to all of us, but of course no one dared to question such a renowned doctor. Maybe he was just one of those people with an incredible vocation for service, someone who felt a deep need to share his knowledge with those who needed it most, or who knows. The fact is, no one really knew what motivated him. As I mentioned before, I was in a tough financial situation, so whenever someone needed to take a day off or couldn't cover their shift, I was the first to volunteer. It was a way to earn some extra money, and everyone at the hospital knew that if money was involved, I was willing to take any shift. I needed the cash to climb out of the hole I had dug myself into. Then, one day, this doctor called me. I was surprised since he had never done that before. In fact, until that moment, we had only exchanged a few words during my time working there, so it was quite strange that he wanted to talk to me. I went to his office, and to my surprise, he invited me to lunch. We went to a restaurant where it was just the 2 of us and the staff. There was no one else around at that hour. I found that a bit odd, and I had the impression that he knew everyone working there. For the next 30 minutes, he started asking me questions about myself and my family, especially wanting to know if I had debts or expenses. I told him about the scam I fell for with the online fraud, and then he asked how much money I would need to make each month to feel financially secure without any more worries. These questions also struck me as quite strange. For a moment, I even thought the invitation might be something more romantic, but even with the personal questions, I didn't sense any flirting in the conversation. This made me even more intrigued. I don't remember the exact amount I mentioned, but I clearly remember what happened next. He looked at me and said a sentence that changed everything. "What would you be willing to do if I paid you 3 times that amount?" I fell completely silent for a few seconds, eyes wide open, thinking, is this for real? The way he said it with a serious and somewhat sinister voice left me stunned. At that moment, I remembered something my grandfather told me when I was a child, that we should never let an opportunity pass by because it might never come again. So I replied that I would do almost anything he asked. At that moment, a dark smile slowly began to form on his face, and he started to explain what was behind this proposal. The doctor told me he had a scheme with 2 other doctors and some nurses. He also knew someone from the morgue, but that person had transferred to another hospital. "I know you don't work in the morgue," he said, "but I also know you have a good relationship with the people there and can move around without raising suspicion." That's when I realized things were taking a very dark turn, but I kept listening. He explained that these 2 doctors worked only with the nurses involved in the scheme. When one of the doctors assisted in a birth where the baby didn't survive, the nurses would notify the other doctor while the first one would take the baby's body to the morgue. The second doctor, along with trusted nurses, would assist in another birth, and even if the baby was born alive, they would convince the mother that the baby had been stillborn and also take the baby to the morgue. And that's how the scheme worked. At that moment, I felt my throat tighten, and I had to swallow hard. He continued, "What I need you to do is duplicate the records, meaning the deceased baby will appear twice, once for the mother whose baby was really stillborn, and another for the mother who was tricked into believing so." What I had just heard was so dark that it took me a while to process it. The first thought that crossed my mind was, what are they going to do with the baby that's still alive? But I didn't ask because he continued explaining. The nurse arranges for both families to see the same body without suspecting anything. What happens after the body is handed over isn't your concern. Your job is to ensure that after the families have seen the baby, you take the baby that was born alive and bring it to the back of the morgue. where a black van with tinted windows will always be waiting. They'll open the trunk, you put the baby there, walk back to the hospital, and act as if nothing happened. At that moment, I looked at the doctor, and despite the knot in my throat, I apologized. But I knew I had to look out for myself. So, I said I needed to understand exactly what I was getting into before agreeing. I was already involved to some extent, but I wanted to know if the amount he mentioned was really serious and what the risks were. The doctor gave me a sharp, serious look and said, "Look, when I was at the other hospital in a slow month, I made $5,000. So if I came to this hospital, it's because this business is making me a lot of money. I sell them on the black market online, and I don't know what they use them for, nor do I care. What matters is that for every baby I deliver, I make enough to pay the doctors, the nurses, and if you want in, you too, and I'm still left with over $4,000. I admit I was terrified. I knew that from that moment on I couldn't just say no. It was clear there were dangerous people involved, and by that point I knew too much to walk away as if nothing had happened. Still, I asked what would happen if I didn't accept, or if I ever wanted to leave the scheme, or even if I left the hospital. He looked at me intensely and said, "Once you're in, the only way out is death." I was more nervous than I had ever been in my life. With a trembling hand, I took the last sip of my coffee and said, "I'm in." And that's how I started working. I didn't operate directly on the dark web, but I worked for the doctor, who was deeply involved in that world. In this way, I ended up being part of one of the many grim organizations operating there. The first time I had to do it, I felt an overwhelming urge to cry and vomit. I felt disgusted with myself as a human being, but by then it wasn't just about money anymore. It was my survival at stake. However, after delivering the baby at the end of my shift, the doctor discreetly handed me $500. That made the guilt lessen a bit. I hate to say this, and I apologize because I know what I was doing was horrible, but over time I got used to it. These cases with babies didn't happen every day, but there was a month when I earned $5,500. Sometimes they only asked me to let the already deceased babies through, and I was paid the same. However, no one sells their soul to the devil without consequences. It all fell apart a few years ago when I left the morgue to deliver a baby that was supposedly dead. The procedure went as usual, and the van was there as always, but suddenly I heard a series of gunshots. The van sped off, and out of nowhere I was surrounded by several undercover men. They forcibly put me in a white car, gagged, tied my hands, and blindfolded me. I stayed in the car for about 3 hours until we finally stopped at a house. I was taken out of the car by force, pushed, and tied to a chair. While I was there, they did things to me that I'd rather not remember, much less talk about. When they were done, they left me alone for 2 days without food or water. I was terrified, having no idea who these people were, but I soon found out. On the 3rd day, someone arrived who introduced himself as a cyber police officer from my country. He said I had 2 options: cooperate with them or simply be let go. But it was obvious that this proposal was a trap. By now, the organization must have known I was with the police, and walking out onto the street without protection would be a death sentence. So I had no choice but to cooperate. With the information I provided, they managed to arrest the doctor and his accomplices within the hospital. But we were just a small part of this enormous criminal organization. Currently, both the doctor and I, along with others, are under protection from the authorities since we are key pieces in dismantling this network. Even so, I'm fully aware that at any moment they could find me, and that will be the end of me. As they say, karma doesn't forgive. Beatrice and I met back in high school, and we hit it off right away. It was love at first sight. It didn't take long for us to start dating, and soon we were in a serious relationship. She was always an amazing girl. As time went on, our love only grew stronger. 7 years passed without us ever drifting apart. We even chose the same field of study to stay as close as possible. I know it might sound a bit dependent, and in a way it was, but it worked for us. A few years ago, we decided it was time to take the next step. We wanted to get married. But as you might imagine, weddings aren't cheap, especially when you want to do something at least halfway decent. My idea was a simpler and more intimate ceremony, but she wanted something a bit bigger, where we could invite our friends, family, and colleagues. I wasn't too excited about that idea, but if it made her happy, then I was fine with it too. The only problem was that at that time our budget was tight, which delayed our plans a bit. We were doing everything we could to save money because we really wanted to make this dream happen our way. Even though we had some savings, with our jobs and everyday expenses, things were tough. Then, a few months later, Beatrice received an unexpected and very promising job offer that seemed to be the solution to our financial problem. The only catch was that she would need to travel and spend 4 months living in South Korea. In 7 years of our relationship, Beatrice and I had never spent so much time apart, let alone on different continents, so this was a big challenge. At first, I was completely against the idea, but the truth was, the salary was too good for her to turn down, and after all, it was only 4 months apart. During that time, she would work as a consultant for a Korean company that was growing and wanted to enter the American market, but in the meantime, she would have to work at their headquarters in Korea. Even so, the idea of Beatrice being alone in such a distant country worried me a lot. It wasn't just about missing her. I was genuinely concerned for her safety. I was paranoid, imagining all the things that could go wrong. What I didn't expect was that all my fears were about to come true. The distance really got to me. I was anxious all the time, thinking about her and afraid something might happen. A few days after she left, I read a news story about mafias operating in several Asian countries, kidnapping Western women with false job offers for human trafficking. That only fed my paranoia. I can't explain it, but I felt deep down that something bad could happen to her. It was like my sixth sense was trying to warn me. And the fact that I wasn't there to protect her put me in a state of extreme anxiety. I've always hated long-distance relationships, but I wanted to support Beatrice in her growth, and besides, it gave me some comfort knowing she was doing this for our future, for our dream wedding. Shortly after arriving in Korea, Beatrice told me that a colleague suggested they share an apartment. At first, I was a bit suspicious, but then I thought it might be better this way. At least she wouldn't be alone at night, and if something happened, there would be someone nearby to let me know. Beatrice even introduced me to this colleague via video call, and I asked for her number just to have a direct contact in case I needed to know something about my girlfriend. Her name was Yumi, a very friendly and pleasant Japanese girl, and I quickly understood why Beatrice liked her so much. This put me at ease a little, knowing she had company, but the worry never completely went away. When Beatrice moved to Korea, we had to adjust our schedules to be able to talk. Since she was on the other side of the world, our time zones were very different, and I ended up getting used to staying up until 3 a.m. to talk to her via video call when she got off work. At that time, it was 5 p.m. over there. We talked every day after her shift, always at 5 p.m., and one day she told me they were organizing a costume party at work, and she was really excited to go with Yumi. It all seemed fine. After all, she worked hard and deserved some fun. That night, as usual, I stayed up until 3 a.m. to talk to Beatrice, but she didn't answer my calls. Of course, it was the night of the costume party at work. I decided to wait a little longer until she got home. To pass the time, I decided to check Facebook, and by coincidence, I saw a new post in a group I follow called I Love Korea. I started following this group a while back because they always post useful information for Americans who don't know much about Korean culture and life. They talk about everything from the best housing options to jobs and other essential tips for those moving there. Most of the comments were very positive, but one caught my attention in particular, one that said, "If you're thinking about going to Korea, you need to see this first," with a link next to it. I confess I looked at the link for a second, thinking about ignoring it, but for some reason I ended up clicking, and that's when everything started. As soon as I clicked, a low-quality video began playing, showing a blonde woman, completely naked, with her hands tied to the ceiling by a rope and a white mask on her face that said, "Bitch." My first reaction was to think it was just one of those bizarre adult videos for people who are into that sort of thing, you know. I closed the video right away, but it opened again, continuing exactly from the same point, with the same image. I closed it again and it reopened again over and over until finally I let it play. Then the video expanded to take up the whole screen on my phone. At that moment, I thought my phone had gotten a virus or something. I'm not very good with these things, but the video kept playing, and after a few moments another figure appeared on the screen. It was a man wearing a samurai mask, holding a huge katana. Up until that point, I still thought it was just another one of those bizarre pornographic videos, a sick montage. But what happened next became etched in my mind as the scariest thing I've ever seen. When the man started approaching, the girl began screaming, begging him not to hurt her, pleading for him to let her go. But then, this guy looked straight into the camera, gave a salute, and without any hesitation, cut her body in half. I can't even describe what I felt at that moment. It was complete shock, something I never expected to see. After that, the man approached the camera and started waving slowly. A second later, the video shut off. I was completely frozen with that horrible image replaying in my mind over and over. My heart started racing, I could hardly breathe, like I was suffocating, and my hands started sweating and shaking. Without a doubt, it was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen, but the worst part was that I could only think of Beatrice. As soon as I snapped out of that state of shock, still with trembling hands, I tried calling her, but she didn't answer. I called her 10, 20, 30 times, I don't even know how many, but no answer. So, I called Yumi, and the same thing happened. That's when I realized that a few hours earlier, Beatrice had posted a series of photos on her status. Seeing the photos didn't calm me down. I was still shaken by what I had seen, but at least I knew she was okay. Or at least, that's what I thought until I noticed something terrifying. In all the photos Beatrice posted, she was with Yumi, surrounded by several people in costumes. But in the middle of the crowd, right near them, there was a figure I recognized immediately. It was the man with the samurai mask I had seen in the video, appearing in every photo and looking directly at them. At that moment, I jumped out of bed in pure panic, screaming "No" like a madman and dialing Beatrice's number non-stop. But no answer. I tried Yumi's number too, but nothing. Then I threw the phone onto the bed, put my hands on my head, completely terrified, when suddenly the phone started ringing. It was a video call from Beatrice. I jumped back and grabbed the phone, answering right away. But then terror took over me. My worst nightmares had come true. On the screen, I saw Beatrice and her colleague standing next to one of the beds in their room, with their hands tied behind their backs and wearing the same white mask with the word "bitch," just like in the video I had seen, and there beside them was the same man with the samurai mask and the katana. I started screaming, crying uncontrollably. "Leave them alone! Get away from them, you bastard! I'm calling the police! Get out now!" But he couldn't hear anything I was saying. Suddenly he got closer to the camera and made that same salute he had made in the video, but this time he held up a white piece of paper with the words, "Let's make a deal." Completely terrified and with tears streaming down my face, I screamed that I would accept any deal if he let them go. Then he showed another paper with a bank account and said I had 10 minutes to transfer $2,000, or soon those two bitches would turn into 4. I said I would, that I would do whatever it took to save Beatrice, while hearing their screams in the background, begging him not to do anything. Luckily, I had a little more than the amount he asked for in our savings for the wedding. With trembling hands, I started making the transfer while that ticking sound echoed loudly from the other side of the screen. I completed the transaction as quickly as I could and showed the man. He got close to the camera again and showed another white paper that said, "If you call the police, she's dead. Wait." Then he made the same salute and hung up. I kept calling Beatrice non-stop, sending messages, but she didn't answer. A day, 2 days, 3 days passed, and I was losing my mind. During that time, I didn't eat anything, barely slept 1 or 2 hours. My head was about to explode. Never in my life had I felt such fear and desperation. On the 4th day, someone knocked on my apartment door. It was Beatrice. When I saw her standing there at the door, I couldn't believe it. I had already imagined the worst. I hugged her as tightly as I could, and we both cried for a long time. However, no matter how much I asked what had happened during those days, where she had been, how she managed to come back, she never told me anything. Every time I bring it up, she goes silent and pulls away. The same happens when I ask about Yumi. So, over time, I stopped insisting. At some point, we simply decided to put that episode behind us and try to move on with our lives. It's been 5 years, and although we finally managed to get married, start a family, and move forward, that horrifying experience still lingers like a shadow that follows us. We try not to look back too much so as not to relive all that terror,